Hello and welcome to lesson 13 of this Elizabeth I GCSE lesson series. This one focuses on the Spanish Armada. You will need with you your lesson notes booklet, which should have been emailed to you, or you might find it on class charts or on pod, or failing that, and probably the easiest way to get it is to just look at the Google Documents link and click on it in the description of this video. Okay. Once you've got that, let's get ready and let's begin. Okay, on page 12 of your lesson notes booklet, you will find this diagram here, which has some overview of the reasons why Philip II launched the Spanish Armada. You can see the issues of religion that we've talked about for some time, the political problems between England and Spain, Treaty of Joinville, Treaty of Nonsuch, the situation between England and Spain in terms of their political rivalry in Europe, the circumstances of the time that the Duke of Parma has got troops in the Netherlands, and the fact that Elizabeth seems a little hesitant means Philip of Spain thinks that she is weak, and the actions of Drake and the actions of Elizabeth supporting the Dutch rebels, as we talked about in last lesson, antagonized Philip of Spain. Okay, you will see that you have this table in your lesson notes booklet. Why did Philip of Spain send the Armada? What were the long-term reasons? What were the short-term reasons? And we have touched just then on that overview document on some of those long and short-term reasons. You are now going to watch a clip which gives you some explanation as to the further reasons why Philip sent the Armada, and then you're going to read some information and you're going to use that, both the clip and the information, to help you fill in that table. So, first off, the little clip. Here we go. Watch this. Think about long-term and short-term reasons for him sending the Armada.
The news of Mary's execution exploded across the Catholic world. It gave Philip of Spain the excuse he needed to declare war on the heretic Queen. Philip ordered the Duke of Parma to prepare an army in the Netherlands for the invasion of England. The Armada would sail from Spain to collect Parma's force and land them on the English coast. Philip's deadly intentions were no secret. Reluctantly, Elizabeth ordered that the English fleet be readied for the threat. Even now, she hoped to avoid war. She tried negotiating with Parma as the Armada set sail. But there was no mood for compromise amongst her Catholic opponents.
She's an incestuous bastard, begotten and born in sin of an infamous courtesan. Cardinal William Allen, June 1588.
English lookouts scoured the horizon for enemy sails. They sighted them on July the 19th.
So that clip focuses probably most heavily on religious reasons. The long-term reason there is Philip of Spain's Catholicism and his desire to rid England, to rid Europe of Protestantism, and his own animosity towards Elizabeth as this bastard queen. And the short-term reason that was mentioned was the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, and maybe that was a short-term stimulus for him to really get going with this Armada, although I think that's a secondary reason, because actually the Armada were already starting to be built before Mary, Queen of Scots was executed. So, what you are now going to do is pause this, and you are going to use pages 14 to 17, the information there, as well as what you've just seen, to help you fill in the table. Right, so what should you mainly have in your table? Well, the long-term reasons are to do with the political and the religious and the economic rivalry between Spain and England, the long-term issues over England's encroaching on the Spanish Empire, the work of Sir Francis Drake and his piracy, and England's attempts to muscle in on some of the trade and some of the riches that Spain was getting from the New World, the Catholic-Protestant conflict and how that fed into the Philip of Spain versus Elizabeth's conflict, also the political rivalry, two powers in Europe trying to compete against each other. Long-term issue to do with the Spanish Netherlands and Elizabeth's involvement there. In the short term, there is the Treaty of Non-Such and the sort of open warfare between Elizabeth and Philip of Spain. There are the actions of Sir Francis Drake, the singeing of the King of Spain's beard at Cadiz, which we'll come to in a moment. These things are the short-term trigger, and you could put in there the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, as the sort of final thing. However, I do think that that's a secondary issue because Philip had already made his mind up he was going to send an armada long before Elizabeth executed her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. So we're now going to move on to a question, which is, why did the Spanish Armada fail? So sorry to spoil the ending and ruin the suspense, but the Spanish Armada does fail. Right, now on page 18 of your lesson notes booklet, you will find the question, why did the Armada fail? And it narrows it down to 3 possible reasons why the Armada failed. So one is to do with the English skill and tactics, another is to do with Spanish failures, and another is to do with just luck or circumstance. You're going to watch a video clip and you need to use that and then the notes or the excerpt from the textbook that comes on pages 19 and 20 of your lesson notes booklet to try and gather evidence that supports one of those 3 reasons why the Armada failed. So we're going to build up a picture of how these 3 reasons help to explain the failure of the Armada. So first, watch this clip and then consider what evidence there is to support each of the 3 reasons why the Armada failed.
Commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, it was to meet up with an invasion force under the command of the Duke of Parma in Flanders. The army would then cross over and land in the south of England, quickly seizing London. There was a setback, however, in April 1587 when Sir Francis Drake raided Cadiz, destroying or capturing over 30 Spanish ships. But a year later, the Armada was ready, setting sail from A Coruña on the 21st of July 1588. With their extensive network of spies all over Europe, the English were well informed of the Spanish king's intentions and had their own navy ready and waiting on the south coast. Their commander-in-chief was High Admiral Lord Howard of Effingham, supported by a number of famous commanders including Drake and fellow privateer John Hawkins and Martin Frobisher. The nature of naval warfare had changed significantly during the 16th century. Medieval fleets had mostly consisted of merchant ships pressed into service on a temporary basis. Only recently had the governments of the day had the resources to fund the construction of specialized warships and to maintain permanent navies. The increased use of gunpowder was another major factor that had changed the face of naval combat. Medieval ships had acted like floating castles. Encounters between ships consisted mostly of boarding actions, with wooden towers on the bow and stern serving as shooting platforms. From 1500 onwards, warships like the Mary Rose had started to come fitted with gun ports, designed to deliver devastating broadsides to the enemy. But this was a transitional period, and boarding was still very much in use as a standard tactic. The transitional nature of naval warfare in the 16th century was reflected in the makeup of the fleets. The core of the Catholic fleet consisted of 22 large galleons, which were armed with cannon, but mostly designed for transport, and 4 oar-powered galleasses. They were supported by over 100 armed merchant vessels. A total of 18,000 men were on board the ships. Combined with the army in Flanders, this would have amounted to an invasion force of over 50,000, and a huge number of men for the time. The English had 34 race-built warships developed by John Hawkins. which were smaller and more maneuverable than the Spanish galleons. These were supported by 163 merchant vessels. The English fleet received word on the 29th of July that the Spanish had been sighted off the coast of Cornwall. They managed to outmaneuver the Armada under the cover of darkness, and on the 31st of July, the first action was fought off Plymouth. From their superior upwind position, the English bombarded the Spanish from afar, denying them the advantage that the larger ships would have had at close range. They failed to sink any ships, although 2 Spanish vessels were abandoned after colliding. As the Armada headed east along the south coast of England, another similarly indecisive action was fought off Portland. The Spanish then tried to enter the Solent, where they could take shelter and wait for the Duke of Parma's army to give word that it was ready to cross. But the English fleet fended them off, and they decided to head to Calais instead. Communication had always been a major problem. Arriving at Calais on the 6th of August, it quickly became clear that the army at Dunkirk had been severely reduced by disease and still needed preparation. The Armada would therefore be forced to anchor, unable to find shelter and vulnerable to attack. Now, on the evening of the 7th, the English fleet arrived, finding the Armada moored in a crescent formation. That night, they sent out 8 fire ships, which they set alight and left to drift towards the enemy. In panic, the crews cut the anchor cable and left the ships to drift downwind. By morning, the Spanish were in a state of chaos, and the stage was set for the Battle of Gravelines. The English approached the Spanish ships for the big showdown. They wanted a decisive action this time, but they worked out that they needed to get within 100 meters in order to penetrate the Galleons' holes. They would need a plan in order to get this close without being sunk first, but the Spanish had some key tactical weaknesses that they could exploit. The Spanish naval doctrine was in many ways still stuck in the old medieval mindset, favoring boarding actions where their superior manpower would play to their advantage. Their ships were also stocked to the gills with supplies for the invasion. This meant that many of the gun decks were so crowded that the cannons couldn't be brought into the position to reload properly after firing. The idea was, therefore, for the gun crews to just fire 1 salvo, then get onto the position for boarding. The English, on the other hand, knew what sort of key role that cannon could play in naval warfare. They therefore got just close enough to provoke a single ineffectual salvo from the Spanish, then quickly closed in and opened fire. The ship's crews were close enough to exchange musket fire, but the English used their maneuverability to avoid getting boarded. They just carried on pounding the Spanish holes for the next 8 hours until being forced to withdraw for lack of ammunition. In total, 5 Spanish ships were sunk, ran aground, or were captured. Many others were badly damaged, and it was now clear to the Spanish that there would be no invasion. The bulk of the Spanish fleet would likely have been driven aground had the wind not suddenly backed south. They escaped north, pursued, and hurried up the east coast of England. The only choice for them now was to head back to Spain by passing anti-clockwise around the British Isles. The English ended their pursuit on the 12th of August, off the Firth of Forth. It was not long after that disaster truly struck the Invincible Armada. The Spanish hoped to head westward into the comparatively safe water of the Atlantic before turning south towards home. However, these were the days before longitude could accurately be measured. Unbeknownst to the Spanish, the Gulf Stream was carrying the ships northeast, and they ended up steering south far earlier than they intended, passing perilously close to the west coast of Ireland. Strong winds pushed them into the rocky shore. Having abandoned their anchors at Gravelines, they could not take shelter and ran aground. Local inhabitants and English troops looted the ships and killed the crews. Around 35 of the Spanish ships were lost. The Atlantic Ocean had taken a far greater toll than the English cannon ever did. When the remains of the Armada finally reached Spain again in September and October 1588, many of the men on board were dead from disease or starvation. Less than 10,000 remained. Of the 130 ships that had set sail, 67 made it back. England had lost less than 100 men in battle, but disease was just as big a problem for them, claiming several thousand. The Spanish Armada was seen as a major propaganda victory for Europe's Protestants, and ultimately became part of British national mythology, an early episode in emergence of England as a naval power and beginning of the British Empire. The contemporary reality was somewhat different. Spain had failed in her objective, but had not been decisively defeated, and would retain hegemony at sea for several more decades. In military terms, the Spanish Armada appeared to be a vindication of English-style naval tactics, using dedicated maneuverable warships and engage the enemy with cannon and broadsides. These methods would be developed into the classic line of battle, which formed the core doctrine of naval tactics in the 17th and 18th centuries. Boarding actions were becoming increasingly outdated. However, they were by no means obsolete and still regularly took place well into the 19th century. So
what you need to do now is to look at the information on page 19 and 20 in your lesson notes book. Maybe go back and look at that clip again, pick out some key bits. You are looking for evidence, knowledge to put in support of those three key reasons why the Armada failed. Was it to do with good English naval tactics? Was it to do with poor Spanish tactics, problems that they had, or was it just to do with luck and circumstance? So, off you go. Okay, so we should have seen that really the reason that the Armada was defeated is a combination of different reasons. For sure, some of it was to do with some good naval tactics and some good strategy from the English themselves. So Drake's singeing of Philip of Spain's beard, so his raid on Cadiz in 1587, was certainly important in slowing down the Armada. It delayed it by a year and it gave the English longer to prepare. What's also significant is the different types of naval vessels that the English had, which made them more maneuverable, which made it easier for them to defeat some of the big Spanish galleons. Having said that, there is also the reality that the Spanish plan was not particularly good. How in the absence of mobile phones and other technology, a fleet of ships was supposed to communicate with an army that was on land several hundred miles away is beyond most historians to fathom how the Spanish thought that was going to work. And so there were some flaws in the plan and some poor decisions taken along the way by the Spanish. And there's also the element of luck and circumstance, the changing wind direction, the storm that destroyed a lot of the Armada in the end is not something that either side could have necessarily planned for. So, if we're answering the question, why was the Armada defeated, then they're the three main reasons that we should be able to explain in order to answer that question. And we see this portrait here, the Armada portrait of Elizabeth. We see her hand on the globe, which symbolizes the growing power of England and the development of an empire. We see in the window on the left-hand side over Elizabeth's right-hand shoulder the Armada on its way, and we see on the right-hand side the window over her left shoulder the scattered Armada, which signifies the victory that Elizabeth and the English had over the Spanish. And it was a significant victory, and in some respects it cemented Elizabeth's position as queen, and it also began a process in which English naval dominance and an imperial presence grew in the late 16th and then for the rest of the 17th century. It is worth noting, however, that the Spanish sent another armada a year later, another one a few years after that. They didn't give up on getting rid of Elizabeth and removing her and restoring Catholicism to England. It's just that this was the most significant attempt and it was defeated. Okay, so at the end of the Elizabeth exam, you get a choice of two 16-mark questions that you have to answer. These 16-mark questions will always have a statement and then the question, how far do you agree? So we have here, the effective use of naval tactics was the main reason for English victory over the Spanish Armada. How far do you agree? And in the bullet points, which are to give you some assistance, you've got fire ships, so that obviously refers to some of the naval tactics that the English used, but it also says bad weather, and obviously that's to do with luck and circumstance and not a particular tactic that the English used. So answers to these sorts of questions have to have some balance. So on the one hand, it was naval tactics, but on the other hand, it was other things, and you've got to decide whether or not the English victory was mainly because of the effective use of naval tactics, or was it because of other factors? Okay, what we have here is the beginning of an answer. Now, this answer scored in the top mark band in the exam, so it was in the 13 to 16 mark band. It got 15 out of 16. Okay, we have I agree to a certain extent that the main reason for the defeat of the Armada was naval tactics, because because of Drake, English ships and the Navy's communication were a strong contribution, but there were other factors that had an impact, for example, bad weather, Spanish resources, and lack of communication that also contributed to the defeat. The Armada was mainly defeated by a series of events. However, the English naval tactics did have a large contribution. For example, when rumours of the Armada emerged, Elizabeth sent Drake on a voyage to disturb Philip's navy, which consequently caused a setback of the Armada, which gave England more time to prepare. So we're talking about the raid on Cadiz in 1587. Another naval tactic that impacted the defeat was the fire ships. When the Armada was spotted, the British spent in fire ships with cannons destroying some of the Spanish ships. Therefore, the main danger was over. The final way in which the Navy did have a large contribution to the defeat was English ship structure. English ships were better because of other Navy had stronger and more maneuverable ships. Therefore, the Navy was quicker and had an advantage. Now, it's not amazing, this first part of the answer. There's certainly more detailed that the fire ships reference could be a little bit more specific. They didn't send fire ships when they immediately saw the Armada. They sent fire ships when the Armada was harbouring, and they could have been a bit more specificity about the raid on Philip's fleet, and they could have talked about the Cadiz and how that delayed the Armada by a year. But nonetheless, it's got a clear argument. Look, some of it's to do with naval tactics, but some of it's to do with other things. What you're going to do is write the other half of the answer, almost as though we planned it this way. The notes that you should have made, you should have some information on the problems that the Spanish had, some of the resource issues, some of the reasons why the Armada failed because of their inadequacies, and you should also have some information about just luck and circumstance and some of the reasons to do with weather why the Armada failed. So you are going to write the other half of the answer, the space for you to do this, in your answer booklet, or you can just do it on a bit of paper, and then you need to write a judgment at the end as to whether overall you think it was mainly naval tactics, or was it other reasons, or was it a combination of all three. So have a go at writing that and then send it to your teacher. Just the second half of the answer and then a judgment. And so that brings us to the end of lesson 13 on the Spanish Armada. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned lots. Hope you've got yourself a good set of notes to go forward with. And until next time, when we will be having a look at the education system in Elizabethan England, take care, stay safe, and goodbye.